Now, I want to introduce you to our speaker tonight. Evan Weiner is an award-winning journalist. He has a daily video podcast. In the United States, he has been a radio commentator, TV pundit on MSNBC and ABC. He is also an author of 11 books and is a frequent college speaker. In 2007, Evan was selected by the United States Department of State to speak at Texas A&M George Bush Presidential Library. In 2015, Evan was featured on the documentary The Sons of Ben about the economic fall of Chester, Pennsylvania, and how the city thought a soccer team would be a key to economic revival. Welcome, Evan.
Just want to say, thank you for inviting me. I just want to say about Chester, Pennsylvania, it's in bankruptcy right now. So it didn't help, and I'm a villain in the movie, but that's a long story. But if you see the movie, you'll understand it. Thank you, Cheryl, for inviting me. And before I go on, one of the stories that I had covered back in 1989 was Pete Rose being banned from baseball. And I was there with Bartlett Giamatti, and I heard all about the 1919 Chicago White Sox with the whole Pete Rose incident. And I'll talk a little bit about Rose as well. But and I also knew a guy who was in the movie 8 Men Out. That's the Black Sox. They were actually the Chicago White Sox, 1919 American League champion. And they were accused of throwing the 1919 World Series against the Cincinnati Reds. Now, one thing you have to understand about 1919 or 1918 or whatever went prior, there's a lot of gambling on baseball, awful lot of gambling. And baseball players were considered ruffians, not the kind of people you wanted to hang around. And they were in bars all the time and hung out with gamblers and other people. And to the point where if you were a woman, say in 1908, when Take Me Out to the Ball Game, the song came out, and it is a woman who yells, "Take me out to the ball game," Katie Casey, it was considered very unladylike to watch a baseball game or even to say hello to a baseball player because they had such terrible reputation. So there we go. That's the 1919 Chicago White Sox. The 1919 best of 9, they played 9 games. World Series featured the Chicago White Sox in the Cincinnati Reds, and it was fixed. But just how did this happen has never been fully established. There are various accounts, and some of the accounts suddenly disappeared in the courtrooms. It was not baseball's first fix. The American League Chicago team won 88 games out of 154 to get to the 1919 World Series, but lost to the National League Cincinnati Reds. While a grand jury was seated for another possible fixed game, it was learned that a handful of White Sox players were found to have taken money from gamblers in return for throwing the series. And this Chick Gandel, he was the ringleader. Eddie Cicotti, he won 28 games that year. Really good pitcher that year. Shoeless Joe Jackson, and of course there is that debate whether or not Shoeless Joe Jackson should be in the Hall of Fame, and the Field of Dreams movie he's in, well, his character is in that movie. Swede Risberg and Buck Weaver, they were part of it as well. Lefty Williams, he has an interesting story. Fred McMullen, another guy involved, implicated. Hap Felsch, another guy implicated. But, you know, early days of professional baseball. Now, professional baseball allegedly started in 1869 when all the Cincinnati Reds players were paid, but legally paid, not under the table. Lipman Pike got paid in 1868. But players were allegedly amateurs and might have taken some money from the side to kind of throw some games. And in the early days of professional baseball in the 1870s, cricket play was not uncommon, and many players were suspected of throwing games in exchange for money. Gambling had undermined the American National Association in early 1870s. William Holbrook formed the National League in 1876, of which the Chicago Cubs are still a member. with the intention of driving it out of the game. It's Bosch Tweed. I don't know how many of you know Bosch Tweed, but Bosch Tweed may have been the most corrupt mayor ever in the history of the United States. He was the mayor of New York City, Tammany Hall, all that other stuff. He also owned the baseball team. And what do you expect from Bosch Tweed when you own the baseball team? Crooked baseball. 1865, betting scandal involving Bosch Tweed's New York Mutuals, a professional team organized by Tammany Hall boss William Mager Tweed. Thomas Deaver, William Wansley, and Edward Duffy claimed they were victimized by a wicked conspiracy, and they were all banned from baseball for accepting $100 a piece to throw a game. That would probably be about $35,000 today. And they were playing against the Eckfords of Brooklyn in Hoboken, which is across the river. Why would a New York team play a Brooklyn team in New Jersey? And they all had to get there by ferry. All three would eventually be reinstated. That's John Radcliffe. And he was thrown out from baseball because he offered an umpire $175 to win for the Chicago White Sox, the Chicago Cubs today, to win a game. And he was an umpire, rather a player who offered an umpire money. Bill Craver, 1877. The Louisville Grays mysteriously lost 7 games in a row. They were too good to lose 7 games in a row, although losing 7 games in a row has happened to good teams. But people decided they want to see what was really going on. And there was an investigation. And that revealed that gamblers had bought off George Hall and Craver and Al Nichols and Jim Devlin. And the National League founder, William A. Hobart, banned all 4 from baseball. Now, the players said, hey, look, we had an excuse. Our team, they didn't want to pay us. The owner didn't meet the payroll. So we needed money. So we threw the games because we needed the money. But the National League was not forgiving, and all of them were tossed out of baseball. The Grays franchise folded after 1877, possibly because of the fix, but more than likely the team lost money. It lost $2,000. Multiply that by about 35 now, and they lost $70,000. Over the next few decades, there were fewer suspicions of game fixing in professional baseball, but it was taking place. This guy is Dick Hyam. He was a player. The Detroit Wolverines owner, William Thompson, he was an umpire rather, became suspicious of his calls against his team. He had money. So Thompson decides, I'm going to hire a detective to investigate. Several letters between Hyam and a well-known gambler were found. Hyam had a real simple code dealing with the gambler. If the gambler received a telegram from him saying, buy all the lumber you can, the gambler is going to bet on Detroit. If there was no telegram, that meant the gambler was to bet on the opponent. John J. McGraw was Pete Rose. Oh yeah, he was Pete Rose. Manager of the New York Giants. He was the manager of the Baltimore Orioles in the American League, and then was basically tossed out of the league because he wasn't a good guy, but at least on the baseball field. But John J. McGraw ended up in New York with the New York Giants. In 1905, the manager of the New York Giants won $400 betting on his own team to win the 1905 World Series. He is in the Hall of Fame. Pete Rose isn't in the Hall of Fame. Now, let's talk a little bit about John J. McGraw. He did not participate in the 1904 World Series against Boston because he had a grudge against the American League president, Dan Johnson, who suspended McGraw for his boorish on-field behavior during McGraw's tenure as an American League manager in Baltimore. But in 1905, McGraw has a change of mind. We'll play the Philadelphia A's for the World Series. The World Series started in 1903. The Boston Bean Eaters against Pittsburgh. Barney Dreyfuss put that together, the owner of the Pirates. No World Series in '04. And then the New York Giants would beat the A's in 5 games. McGraw, who bet on his team, got his money and his revenge on Van Johnson. He's not thrown out of baseball for betting, unlike Pete Rose, who did the exact same thing. Jack O'Connor. He's pushing Coca-Cola. Jack O'Connor, manager of the St. Louis Americans, a cat on his feet, a glutton for work, full of aggressiveness when he was a player, and now one of the quickest thinkers and most daring and aggressive managers in the league. He's with St. Louis as the manager. He drinks Coca-Cola, and no wonder he likes Coca-Cola. He's like Coca-Cola, full of vim, vigor, and go. You'll like it. It's delicious, refreshing, thirst-quenching. 5 cents everywhere. And whenever you see an arrow, think of Coca-Cola. Well, he was quick on his feet, all right. Yeah, he was smart. He was a smart guy. And he had a third base coach by the name of Harry Howe. And these two guys had a grudge. Jack O'Connor and Harry Howe. Jack was the manager of the St. Louis Browns. Howe, a coach of the St. Louis Browns, were banned in 1910 for attempting not to fix a game, but to fix the outcome of the 1910 American League batting title for the Cleveland Indians player Nat LaJoie against Ty Cobb. These guys did not like Ty Cobb, but they kind of liked Nap. So how was it fixed? LaJoie and they played little ball back in those days. It was the dead ball era. Bunting was a big thing back in those days. So their infield was back. And LaJoie just bunted, and by the time the third baseman got to the ball, or the first baseman, LaJoie was on first. One other thing. Remember I said that women, they really weren't thought highly of if they hung around baseball. Well, in 1910, St. Louis Browns had a woman scorer. O'Connell and Howe tried to bribe the official scorer, who was a woman, to change a call to a hit. What were they going to do? They were going to buy her a new wardrobe. That's how much they hated Ty Cobb. But they got tossed out, and I guess Coca-Cola had to find somebody else to push Coca-Cola. This is the guy who put the word organized in organized crime, Arnold Rothstein. Arnold Rothstein was a gangster with an education, and he was as smooth as they came and very rarely left fingerprints. He might have been involved in the 1919 World Series fix, although he said he never was. And that's Charles Comiskey. He was the owner of the Chicago White Sox, and allegedly he was cheap. Didn't pay his players what the players thought they should be paid. Except if you look in 1919, he did pay for some players. Maybe not to what the players wanted him to pay, but he wasn't that cheap. The scheme: the White Sox first baseman Chick Gandil and a gambler by the name of Joseph Sport Sullivan meet to discuss the possibility of Sox players throwing the championship. Gamblers had long been greasing the palms of disgruntled ball players in exchange for inside tips. It's been going on since literally day one of Major League Baseball. Gandil claimed he was initially skeptical that it could work, but he eventually agreed that he and a few co-conspirators would throw the series in exchange for a hefty payout, around $100,000. And multiply that by about 25 by now. You're talking about significant change. More than $1 million split between a whole bunch of people. Gandil got the pitcher Eddie Ciccati, and another pitcher Claude Lefty Williams, and the shortstop Charles Swede Risberg, and the outfielder Oscar Happy Felch to buy into the scheme. Now, the third baseman Buck Weaver. Buck Weaver is a kind of sad story on his own right, if you just even eliminated this, as I'll tell you in a little bit. Was in the early stages of the plot, but he pulled out. The utility infielder, Fred McMullen, was cut in after he overheard the players talk about the deal. Shoeless Joe Jackson was also approached. And there is Sport Sullivan. He assembled a web of crooks that may have included Sleepy Bill Burns, Bill Morag, and Abe Attell, who was once a professional boxer. And they began raising the bribe money. Now, here's the New York mob leader, Arnold Rothstein, the guy who put organized in organized crime. He may have been a major player, but his involvement has never been proven. And evidence suggests also that Gandel and his co-conspirators may have hatched multiple deals with different syndicates and basically sold the World Series or through the World Series for not just these guys, but a whole bunch of guys as well. There is Attell, the former boxer. He said, Attell, they not only sold the series, but they sold it wherever they could get a buck. Bookies had previously had the Sox winning the World Series over the underdog Cincinnati Reds by as much as 3-1. But the odds shifted after those in the know began betting heaps of cash on the Reds. As the championship drew near, the streets buzzed with rumors that several White Sox players were in the pocket of high-stakes gamblers. Fix these faces in your memory. That was the newspaper in June of 1920. Hap Felch, Chick Gandel, Joe Jackson, Eddie Cicotti, Claude Williams, Fred McMullen, Swede Riceberg, Buck Williams. 8 men charged with selling out baseball. Again, they weren't the first. We're underway. First game of the 1919 World Series between the Cincinnati Reds and the Chicago White Sox. After hitting a batter with one of his first pitches, supposedly a signal that the fix was on, Eddie Cicotti went on to make a series of uncharacteristic blunders from the mound. So this guy won 28 games that year. Chicago lost the game 9-1, and the New York Times weighed in. They reported, never before in the history of America's biggest baseball spectacular has a pennant-winning club received such a disastrous drubbing in an opening game. The faulty play continued in Game 2 when Sox pitcher Lefty Williams gifted the Reds a 4-2 win after walking 3 batters in a row. And people are beginning to talk in Chicago. There are all kinds of whispers. Christy Mathewson, the great pitcher with the New York Giants, won 373 games in his career, went on to manage the Cincinnati Reds, went to World War I, got hit with mustard gas, and basically lived out the rest of his life, not being able to do too much, maybe 7 or 8 years after getting hit with the mustard gas. The plot to throw the World Series was not a well-kept secret. Gamblers and players and sports writers hung out at the same hotels, same bars, same hangouts. And Hugh Fullerton, who was with the Chicago Herald and Examiner, Christy Mathewson, the former manager of the Cincinnati Reds, had it all figured out before the first game. Fullerton later said he approached Comiskey with his suspicions, who dismissed it. But he added he knew what was going on, Fullerton, but he never flushed it out. The Sox are down 4-1. It's Game 6. The players had not been paid the agreed sum by the gamblers through Game 5, so the Sox players played Game 6 and 7s on the level and won. Oh, the gamblers weren't too thrilled about that. You know, the Reds are 1 game away from winning the World Series, and all this cash is on the line. And all of a sudden, hey, you know what? We didn't get paid. We're double crossed. Man, we're gonna play legit. But one of the gamblers allegedly threatened to kill Williams and his wife if the Sox won Game 8. So the pitcher threw the game, and the World Series was over. And that was it. You know, the series was over. Everything dies down. The Reds easily won Game 8. The White Sox owner, Charles Comiskey, was widely known as a skinflint to the point where he charged the players for cleaning their uniforms. Eddie Cicotti was promised $5,000 in a bonus if he won 30 games. He won 29, not 28, 29, but he was benched for several games, didn't pitch, and Comiskey denied him his bonus. Players' meager salaries left some players open to the influence of gamblers. 1920, Eddie Cicotti, his deposition was on display as a historic artifact in Chicago, that toddling town. In it, Cicotti says the 1919 White Sox players had heard of a bribe of an offer of $10,000 to one or more of the Chicago Cubs players on the 1918 World Series between the Cubs and the Boston Red Sox. That was the year that Babe Ruth dominated pitching for the Boston Red Sox when he was a pitcher. So he heard something. Well, whether it was hearsay or not, he did say he heard something told to court. There's Rothstein again. Rothstein was asked to finance the bribery of several White Sox players. Allegedly, he never did. In the end, the White Sox threw the World Series. But Rothstein, who doesn't have any fingerprints on this, is believed to have earned approximately $350,000 by betting on the Cincinnati Reds. So draw your own conclusions. An investigator revealed that Abe Attell, a friend and also an employee of Rothstein's, was involved in making payments to the White Sox players, but Rothstein vehemently denied any involvement and was never identified. So what really happened? What really happened? It's 104 years later. Nobody still knows. Yeah, the series was fixed. That was established. Rothstein, Attell, and others never gave anybody a straight story. The fix was uncovered by accident by a grand jury. 1920 season. Despite suspicions that the 1919 World Series was rigged, the 1920 season started and the previous World Series just faded into oblivion. The last year was last year. This is a new year. But investigators were looking into allegations of a 1920 rigged regular season game between the Chicago Cubs and the Philadelphia Phillies when they stumbled on what they thought was some evidence from 1919. A grand jury is convened to investigate August 31st, 1920, and speculation soon turned to the previous year's World Series. Around the same time, gambler Bill Harrog went public with an account of his own involvement in the fix. Eddie Cicotti decided to testify before the grand jury, tried to clear his name, asked a question. He said, I don't know why I did it. Needed the money, had the wife and kids. Shortly afterwards, the star hitter, Shoeless Joe Jackson, testified and admitted to having accepted $5,000 from his teammates. Over the next few days, Lefty Williams and Oscar Felch also confessed their involvement. On October 22nd, 1920, the grand jury handed down its indictments, naming the 8 Chicago players and 5 gamblers, including Bill Burns, Sport Sullivan, and Abe Attell. Rothstein was not indicated. The indictments Rothstein was not indicted. The indictments included 9 counts of conspiracy to defraud various individuals and institutions. Well, who was being defrauded becomes a question. The judge, Hugo Friend, charged the jury. He told the jury that to return a guilty verdict, they must find the players conspired to defraud the public and others and not merely throw ball games. It's really high bar to prove. On August 2nd, 1921, the Black Sox players were found not guilty on all counts. The ball players' vindication would not last long. Only a day after the acquittal, the judge, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who was the commissioner of baseball, came in to clean it up. But he was an owner's guy, let's put it that way. During the Federal League lawsuit against the National Leagues and the American League, the Baltimore/Maryland Terrapins were suing the American League and National League because they were left out of a settlement. Virtually everybody else in the Federal League ended up with something. The Chicago Whales owner who built Wrigley Field, ended up with the Chicago Cubs. It wasn't Wrigley Field in those days. Almost everybody got something except for the Baltimore people. So Landis ruled against the Baltimore people and went up to the Supreme Court eventually. Wasn't decided by this point. It was decided a little later that baseball was a game, and it was not. It was not an interstate business. But Landis made a ruling in favor of the owners, and the owners fell in love with him. So anyway, he was recently appointed as baseball's first commissioner, and he decreed all 8 players were permanently banned from organizing baseball. But they were not the only 8 players who were banned from organized baseball from the 1919 World Series. Follow me closely on this. And there is Kennesaw Mountain Landis from Georgia. Regardless of the verdicts of juries, Landis wrote, no player who throws a ball game, no player that undertakes or promises to throw a ball game, no player that sits in conference with a bunch of crooked players and gamblers where the ways and means of throwing a game are discussed and does not promptly tell his club about it will ever play professional baseball. And there were some people who fell into that last category, like him, Joe Gideon. He was a friend of Swede Risberg, and he was present during a meeting with gamblers as they were discussing the plot to fix the 1919 World Series. He was on another team. He was later called as a witness in the trial. On November 3rd, 1921, Gideon was banned for life from organized baseball for having guilty knowledge of the Black Sox scandal. That's number 9. Number 9. History's Mysteries. I was on a TV show in 1999 called History's Mysteries. We did the history of sports from the original Olympics to 1999 at the time, and it was a mystery that we were able to do that. I got 4 whole minutes in that. Arthur Kent, remember Arthur Kent, the Scud Stud from the first Iraqi War? Anyway, he was the narrator of this thing. Done by Al Michaels' sister, Susan Michaels. She was the producer. Anyway, paper records relating to the players' grand jury confessions weren't there. What happened to them? They vanished under mysterious circumstances. Never been found. Did Comiskey and Rothstein arrange for the papers to be stolen? Part of a cover-up. The prosecution's case also disappeared. They couldn't find it. Confessions are gone. Prosecution case is gone. What happened? History's Mysteries, a TV show that I was on. 1956, Gendel decides to give an interview. It is now 37 years later, and he comes clean in an interview with Sports Illustrated. On September 28, 1920, the 8 players were suspended. Landis named commissioner on November 11, 1920. That was not the last betting scandal. 1956, Sports Illustrated, an interview. Gendel frankly admitted, I was the ringleader. They were all interested and thought we should recontour to see if the dough would be really put on the line. Weaver suggested we get paid in advance. Then, if things got too hot, we could double cross the gambler, keep the cash, take the big end of the series, the paycheck at the end of the series, by beating the Reds. We all agreed this was a hell of a brainy plan. Well, maybe it wasn't. What happened to all the characters? Well, Cicciotti worked briefly as a Michigan game warden before landing a job at the Ford Motor Company. Jackson played some semi-pro baseball and was a very, very, very successful businessman in North Carolina and South Carolina, operating a liquor store, a barbecue restaurant, and a dry cleaners. Lefty Williams and Fred McMullen both lived quiet lives in California for decades after the scandal. Risberg opened a successful nightclub near the California-Oregon border and spent his final years living with his son Robert in Red Bluff, California. 1970, he was asked to preview the upcoming World Series as a guest columnist for the local newspaper. Swede's columns were short, amiable, but they didn't talk about his connection to baseball. Oh, by the way, he picked the Cincinnati Reds to win the 1970 World Series, which Baltimore won. Weaver remained in Chicago took a job with the city as a day painter. Also tried his hand in the drugstore business with his pharmacist brother-in-law, William Scallon. He opened up 6, which were very successful drugstores on Chicago's South Side. Well, they were doing really well. But there was another guy around who said, hey, why don't you join me in the business and become partners? The guy's name was Walgreens. Come, join us. Be part of it. Charles Walgreen, whose drugstore empire was about ready to skyrocket, asked Scallon and Weaver to join them as junior partners. They declined. Another bad decision by Buck Weaver. Then the Great Depression hit, and Scallon and Weaver were forced to close their stores. And I guess you know the rest of the story with Walgreens. In the mid-1920s, Gandell played with Hal Chase, Buck Weaver, Lefty Williams, and other banished players in the Copper League, which had teams near the U.S.-Mexican border in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. By the early 1930s, Gandell and his wife had settled in Berkeley, California, where he became a plumber. In 1962, Felch is over 70 years old and retires as a crane operator for the George Meyer Company. His family adoringly remembered him as always being in a good mood, card playing, bowling, hunting, fishing, smoking, coffee drinking. Yeah, he liked that. And he also liked listening to Milwaukee Braves baseball on the radio. It took a while before the Milwaukee Braves were actually on TV in Milwaukee. They only did radio games into the mid-60s before moving to Atlanta. Comiskey continued as the owner of the White Sox until his death in 1931. 8 years later, Comiskey was elected to the Hall of Fame. Hal Chase. He was an interesting character. He's a really good baseball player, but he punched umpires out. He's ended up being a bad teammate. Prince Hal was a great batter who, it was believed through games in his 15-year career. It's never proven, but after the 1919 season, in which he played for the New York Giants, he was unofficially banned from Major League Baseball. Later, he was officially banned from the Pacific Coast League for, among other things, offering an umpire a bribe. Allegedly, he did that when he was in the major leagues. Coincidentally, he's thrown out after 1919, the same year of the White Sox. His Giants teammate, the 1912 Triple Crown winner, the guy best batting average, home runs batted in, Heine Zimmerman, was also barred from baseball, and 2 after the 1919 season for fixing games. So you got 8 guys, you got these 2 guys, and 1 guy in the meeting. You got 11 guys that they've nailed by 1920. The Babe. Now, the Babe was a different story, and Babe Ruth probably saved baseball. One reporter wrote, this new fan didn't know where first base was, but he had heard of Babe Ruth and wanted to see him hit a home run. When Babe hit one, the fan went back the next day and knew not only where first base was, but where second base as well. Babe Ruth came in, he hit home runs. In fact, he had more home runs than the entire American League in 1921. He saves baseball. Interest in baseball, which should have hit rock bottom with the scandal. Well, Babe revised it. Babe was one of those guys in the 1920s that was known worldwide. Rudolph Valentino, Charlie Chaplin, Jack Dempsey. Those were the big stars internationally, and Babe was one of them and probably saved baseball. Oh, another guy didn't learn his lesson. Gene Paulette, St. Louis Cardinals. He was permanently suspended from organized baseball. He had allegedly received gifts from St. Louis gamblers and also offered to throw some games early in the 1919 season. So now you got the 8 plus the 2 plus the 1 plus the 1. You have 12 guys who were involved in all this. And Jimmy O'Connell, this comes a little later. You would think that he would have learned a lesson. In the final series of the 1924 season, New York Giants playing the Philadelphia Phillies at the Polo Grounds, battling for the pennant with the Brooklyn Dodgers. O'Connell offered the Philadelphia Phillies shortstop Heine Sand $500 to throw the games. Now, Sand listened to Landis, and he continued playing. He rejected the bribe, told it to the Phillies manager, Art Fletcher, and O'Connor was nailed. It would eventually lead to the lifetime suspension of O'Connell and also the Giants coach, Cozy Dolan, by the commissioner Landis, although there were other guys like the future Hall of Famer, Frankie Frisch, and the future Hall of Famer, George Kelly, and the future Hall of Famer, George Youngs, who were implicated in some sort of betting scandal, but somehow they skated. And then there was this, Ty Cobb, Tris Speaker. And did they bet on the 1919 World Series? This comes out in 1926. Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker were permitted by Ban Johnson to resign from baseball. Resign near the end of the 1926 season after a former pitcher, Dutch Leonard, charged that Cobb, Speaker, and Smokey Joe Wood had joined him just before the 1919 World Series in betting on a game they all knew was fixed. So you got all those guys. Now you got more guys from 1919. That makes it 16, right? Leonard presented letters and other documents to Johnson, and Johnson thought they would be so potentially damaging to baseball in the wake of the Black Sox scandal, which was 7 years earlier, that he paid Leonard $20,000 to shut his mouth, get rid of the papers, get rid of all the evidence. It never happened. I know nothing. Landis exposed the cover-up, and eventually the fallout forced Johnson out of his job as president of the American League, a league he had created. Cobb and Speaker vehemently denied any wrongdoing. Landis eventually let both players remain in baseball because they had not been found guilty of fixing any games themselves. This is a whole nest of people. The last guy before Pete Rose was banned for betting was the owner of the Philadelphia Phillies, or the Philadelphia Blue Jays. They were thinking of changing the name of the team to Blue Jays back in the mid-1940s. The Philadelphia Phillies owner, and they were the Blue Jays in 1943, Billy Cox, was banned for betting on his team's games. Oh, Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays were thrown out of baseball because of Judge Landis, who was long dead when they were thrown out of the game after both of their careers were over. 1979, Willie Mays signed as an ambassador for an Atlantic City casino. In 1983, Mantle did the same for another casino. Each was paid $100,000. Bowie Kuhn, who somehow avoided jail, I'm going to sidetrack here for 1 second here. Bowie Kuhn was partners with a guy named Harvey Meyerson. Harvey Meyerson was the attorney for the United States Football League in 1986 in the antitrust trial against the National Football League. And Harvey and a guy, Dan Cooper, I knew both Harvey and Dan, went into the business with Bowie Kuhn. They had their own law firm, and they apparently built customers. Harvey and Dan took the fall. Bowie didn't take the fall, but he hung out in Florida. And he's the guy who is banning Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle, banned them from the game. Peter Ueberroth, PU, a guy who I crossed swords with a few times. I didn't like him. He didn't like me, but I had a lot of respect for him. Awful lot of respect for him. Taught me a lot about the business of baseball and how it operates. But we didn't like each other. But still, you know, I respected him. Ueberroth talking about Mantle and Mays being thrown out under the you can't gamble and be part of the clubhouse or whatever, even though Mantle and Mays weren't. There was literally nothing damning there. They had played golf at casino-sponsored outings as celebrities. They were on casino billboards promoting the golf events, not gambling. Wasn't even a close call. No umpire needed. Bowie threw him out. Ueberroth brought him back. Okay, I covered this back in 1989. I was with Giamatti. I was with Reuven Katz, who was the attorney for Pete Rose. I was with the insufferable John Dowd, who was baseball's attorney in all of this. Ueberroth knew about it, didn't do anything about it. He was being fired as commissioner, and he said, you know what? I don't have to put any effort in here because they're going to fire me anyway. And he got fired, and Giamatti was brought in. And Giamatti brought in John Dowd. Giamatti was the National League president who got kicked over to commissioner. So I was there. I wasn't in Cincinnati. I was in New York for all of the stuff. The only thing I missed was the courthouse in Cincinnati, where Rose was suing baseball to get an injunction to get baseball off of his back. This is Major League Baseball Rule 21D, which came in after the White Sox, 1919. Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Any player, umpire, or club, or league official, or employee who shall bet any sum whatsoever upon any baseball game in connection with which the bettor has a duty to perform shall be declared permanently ineligible. And that was the one that tripped up Pete Rose. No evidence was discovered that Rose bet against the Cincinnati Reds from John Dowd. They couldn't find it. They found other things, but they didn't find that. Rose's betting slips, written in his own handwriting, as well as other evidence, indicated that he only bet on certain Reds games. Now, something inside that I'm going to tell you about. 1989 in New York, there was something called Sports Phone. There was a Sports Phone in Chicago and a few other places. But Pete Rose was the guy who called the inside line at Sports Phone in New York, a guy named Bobby Gurkowski. Bobby G was the guy on the other end, and he would tell Rose what was going on because he had the ticker tape, whatever they were using in those days, 1987, 1988. So Bobby told me what was going on, and he said he would just give Pete Rose information. If it wasn't him, there were some other guys who were working there. Rose was informally questioned in February 1989 by the commissioner of baseball, Peter Ueberroth, and the National League president, Bart Giamatti. Rose vehemently denied the allegations. By this time, the MLB owners had elected Giamatti to succeed Ueberroth. They weren't happy that Ueberroth had some collusion issues that he bestowed on baseball, and he ended up paying about $140 million to the players because of collusion, something like that. Anyway, the outgoing commissioner decided to leave the matter to be dealt with by Giamatti. Sports Illustrated gave the first public detailed report of the allegations that Rose had placed bets on baseball games on March 21st, 1989. Yeah, okay, it's John Dowd. I'll pass on him. John Dowd interviewed many of Rose's associates, including alleged bookies like Peter Jansen's, and bet runners. He delivered a summary of his findings to the commissioner in May 1989. In it, Dowd documented Rose's alleged gambling activities in 1985 and 1986 and compiled a day-to-day account of Rose's alleged betting on baseball in 1987. One thing that always struck me, if Rose is betting on baseball and they know who the bookie is, how come they never arrested the bookie? It was a question that was never answered back in 1989. The Dowd Report. Yes, that Dowd Report documented his alleged bets, him being Rose, on 52 Reds games in 1987, where Rose wagered a minimum of $10,000 a day and called Bobby G every day, I'm sure. Rose agreed to a lifetime ban from Major League Baseball on August 23rd, 1989. Major League Baseball agreed to make no formal finding with regard to the gambling allegations, but when you said hello to John Dowd, he would repeat chapter and verse about everything that Pete Rose bet on, even though he wasn't supposed to talk about it. And Pete Rose is on the outside looking in, 4,192 hits, the crowning of the hit king. He had all the most hits in Major League Baseball history. Now, Rose is ineligible to be enshrined in baseball's Hall of Fame. Like I said, John J. McGraw is there, and he did the same thing in 1905. He's had very limited official Major League Baseball involvement since 1989. And there's the debate whether or not he belongs in the Hall of Fame. And it's worse now because Major League Baseball has all of these sports books that are marketing partners of theirs, or the official sports book of Major League Baseball. Roger Kahn was a writer here in New York. He wrote The Boys of Summer, which you probably have in your library. He's a very well-respected guy. who wrote in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And he's doing an autobiography of Pete Rose. And he writes a book with Rose in 1989 entitled Pete Rose, My Story. Kahn says he repeatedly demanded from Rose assurances that he had not bet on baseball. Well, Kahn should have called Bobby G over at Sports Phone, and Bobby G would have told him that he did. Like I said, I knew Bobby G. Rose always responded thusly, Kahn says, I have too much respect for the game. Several years after the book came out, Rose told an interviewer, yeah, sure, I bet on baseball, which Roger Kahn weighed in on, saying, I wanted to vomit. He did write The Boys of Summer. They are not the only, there you go, Boys of Summer. Sports is filled with all this. CCNY, great college basketball team, City College of New York, back in the early 1950s. And Claire B was the coach, and they won the NIT and the NCAA back in the day. Anyway, 1951, 32 college basketball players from 7 schools around the country were caught up in a point-shaving scandal that hit 4 New York schools and 3 out of 4 state teams, including University of Kentucky. The accused players had been on CCNY's 1950 team, which became the first and only team ever to win the NCAA and NIT tournaments. The National Football League, they are now suspending guys for legally betting on the NFL games. Baltimore News Post, NFL, suspends Horning and Karras, Paul Horning and Alex Karras for betting on NFL games. Detroit Club fined players, Detroit Club, 5 players fined. They were suspended for 1 year. The thing is about the National Football League, unlike Major League Baseball, which was built on gambling, NFL is all about gambling. I don't know how many people would watch it just to watch it for a sport. You have some money riding on it. It's pretty cool. Horning and Karras routinely bet up to $500 on NFL games while associating with known gamblers. In issuing his indefinite suspension in 1963, Pete Rozelle took great care to mention that neither player bet on or against their own teams, and the suspension is gone after a full season. The NFL lives on the point spread. Tim Doherty, Tim Donaghy rather. There he is with Michael Jordan, who has some betting stuff in his past. 2007, an FBI investigation revealed that Tim Donaghy, longtime NBA referee, had bet on NBA games, fed information to other gamblers after falling into debt. Connie Hawkins was a really nice guy. Really nice guy. In fact, I was looking at something. I have his phone number from 30 years ago on something. He got thrown out of college, and he got thrown out of the NBA because he was in the vicinity of a gambler. He was booted from the University of Iowa after his freshman year after testifying in the 1961 point-shaving case against Jack Molinas. You're not in the New York area, so let me just explain this to you. There was an area called the Catskills, or the Bosch Belt, about 90 miles from New York City. Lots of hotels that were there, big-time entertainment and all. But the National Basketball Association and basketball in the summer, that's where they were. And there were a lot of people up there, a lot of guys who were of questionable character hanging around players, and betting going on in these summer games that were played. Now, Hawkins was never charged with doing anything wrong, except perhaps hanging out with some people he should have avoided. He didn't play a single varsity game at Iowa. Doug Moe, Roger Brown, also around the same people, all ended up in the American Basketball Association because they were banned from playing in the American Basketball Association because they were banned by the NBA commissioner or president. In those days was the commissioner, Walter Kennedy. Oh, Brown and Hawkins are Hall of Fame players. Doug Moe enjoyed a very long playing career in the ABA and a very long coaching career in the NBA. Henry Hill, oh, the good fellows, they're involved here too. More basketball. Dixie Classic scandal, 1961. Boston College players point shaving. It was perpetrated by the gangsters Henry Hill and Jimmy Burke in the Tulane men's basketball point shaving scandal, 84-85, which led to the university disbanding its program for 4 seasons. But let's talk about Goodfellas for a minute. Henry Hill was born in Brooklyn, and you might have the movie Goodfellas there. Anyway, Henry Hill was born in Brooklyn, New York on June 11th, 1943, and he worked his way up in the Lucchese crime family from a younger age. Arrested for drug trafficking in 1980, he became a federal informant and joined the Witness Protection Program for a number of years. Hill's life is the basis of the 1990 Martin Scorsese movie Goodfellas. Right there. So, what do you got now? You got legalized sports gambling. Every league is involved with legalized sports gambling, including Major League Baseball. In fact, in some stadiums, well, all stadiums where gambling's legal, all you need is this mobile app, and you can bet from your seat inside the baseball stadium. There used to be signs, no gambling, no betting. Well, that's long gone. Supreme Court of the United States cleared the way for state governments to open up sports books in New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Mississippi, New Mexico, and Rhode Island in 2018. They all joined Nevada as sports gambling venues. There are now 37 states that you could bet in. It was Chris Christie, seen there, and conservative lawyer Ted Olson that went after the National Football League that tried to block sports gambling. The NFL tried to strike down the 2011 New Jersey voter approval of legalized sports gambling in the state and won at every judicial level until the Supreme Court ruled in May 2018 against the NFL and in favor of the state of New Jersey, and that opened all the doors. Why did New Jersey state officials want sports gambling? Well, in part to boost Atlantic City's economy. By the early 2000s, Atlantic City gambling didn't help. The economy was in shambles. So New Jersey officials saw Nevada's betting numbers and said, hey, we might be able to bring back Atlantic City. We're against sports gambling. We're against sports gambling. Major League Baseball put out a statement in May of 2018 about sports gambling. Today's decision by the United States Supreme Court will have profound effects on Major League Baseball as each state considers whether to allow sports betting. We will continue to seek the proper protections for our sport in partnerships with other sports leagues. What was the proper protection? Go out and get a marketing partner. Like I said, until they were not. That's the baseball commissioner, Rob Manfred. And here he is. Hey, we just signed a big money deal with MGM Grand Resorts. That's what it's all about. MGM becomes MLB's official gaming partner. MLB encourages gambling, makes the owners a lot of money in marketing deals, and it may spark some additional interest in games. And we make money. DraftKings, MLB strategy. So can it happen again? Can these 8 guys impact people 104 years later? Well, it seems to be happening with legalized sports gambling because the NFL suspended that guy last year, Calvin Ridley, for betting. Well, he bet from the locker room, from his mobile phone. That's a no-no. On March 7th, 2022, the NFL suspended Atlanta Falcons wide receiver Calvin Ridley for 1 year after it was determined he bet on games. A league investigation uncovered no evidence indicating any inside information was used or that any game was compromised in any way, nor was there any evidence suggesting any awareness by coaches, staff, teammates, and other players of his betting activity. He was the first. There have been about 4 or 5 others who have been suspended. And Brian Flores, who was the coach of the Miami Dolphins, accused his owner, and that is Stephen Ross, of wanting to tank games. Brian Flores, the former coach for the Miami Dolphins, who was fired in January 2022 by the team, said in a lawsuit and he was offered $100,000 by the owner, Stephen Ross, in 2019 for each loss he was able to complete. Flores claimed in recent filing that the offer was meant to help the Dolphins get a better draft pick in 2022. Flores claims his refusal to comply with an agreement to accept money to throw games was the beginning of his end with the Miami Dolphins. The NFL came up with an investigation and said, yeah, he talked about tanking. He talked about tanking. It's just talk. Nothing to see here, and nothing happened. And more suspensions. In April 2023, 3 NFL players were suspended indefinitely for betting on NFL games in the 2022 season, while 2 others received 6-game suspensions for betting on non-NFL games at a league facility. Quintez Cephas, CJ Moore, Shaka Toney were suspended indefinitely, while Stanley Berryhill and Jameson Williams were suspended 6 games. And that's the latest. Players are getting suspended for betting legally on games, but they're getting suspended for betting legally on games from the locker rooms. Oh, by the way, that guy to my right there, Rob, he's the head now of the Connecticut Lottery. We were on MSNBC that day, and the Connecticut Lottery has its tentacles in betting as well in Connecticut, sports betting. So it's there. It's not going away. The question is, why is Pete Rose not in the Hall of Fame if he did the same thing as John J. McGraw? And what happens if college kids start betting? And that's a good question, because the new head of the NCAA, Charlie Baker, the former governor of Massachusetts, recently said he'd like to see more college kids bet on games. They have enough problems affording to go to college, and now he wants to see the college kids bet more on the games. Anyway, thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? Go ahead.
Yeah, please, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat.
Or open it up.
Okay, got a quiet room tonight. Okay.
All right. Well, I hope they enjoyed it.
Well, I think so. I know I did. I never knew so much about how much gambling there is going on in professional.
What I left out here, I'll add this. There was a guy in Chicago by the name of Charles McNeil, University of Chicago graduate, taught JFK at where did he go? Riverdale School over here when JFK lived 9/10 of a mile from me with his family in Bronxville. And he came up with the point spread. He was the guy who perfected it. And basically people used to bet on games, wins and losses. But what he did with the point spread was he said the team is going to win by 1.5 or lose by 2.5 points. And that heightened interest in both the college game and the NFL. And this guy was a compulsive bettor. The Chicago syndicates wanted him to join them, but he said, nope, not doing it. He was a mathematics genius, and he came up with this. And every year before the Super Bowl, I do some podcasts and I do some radio and TV spots. And I said, the guy who's never talked about the Super Bowl, who's responsible as anybody else for the Super Bowl, is Charles K. McNeil. The University of Chicago math professor taught John F. Kennedy, came up with the point spread. The point spread, which basically enhanced football. And so I left him out, but there's a whole set of ancillary talks that you could give on the whole thing about gambling. And and now I have a friend, Arnie Wexler, who's a counselor, talks about gambling. And he said the fact that the gambling's out there right now, he said, you got kids, 23 years old, got college loans out to here, and who are literally gambling addicts right now, and they keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing gambling on people, and nobody cares. Nobody cares, because you could lose your family, you could lose this, that, you could lose everything. But the leagues want you to gamble. As far as Pete Rose, put him in the Hall of Fame. You got John McGraw in the Hall of Fame. He did the same thing Pete Rose did. You know what? There are other people, O.J. Simpson, Lawrence Taylor, Football Hall of Fame. You know what? Put Pete Rose in there. He was a great baseball player. That's all that matters.
You have some nice comments. Excellent presentation. Thank you to everyone for continuing to provide great programs. And another one, fantastic information. Learned a lot. I didn't know, even though I've read a lot about baseball. So we do have an appreciative audience. I think I did want to mention, Evan has a program coming up in September, the Space Race and the Cold War on September 12th at 2:00. It's not published yet. It will hit our online calendar probably August 1st. So if you would like to enjoy more of Evan's programs, August 1st, you can sign up for the Space Race and the Cold War.
Yeah, and that comes, some of it comes firsthand from a guy by the name of Dick Hull, who worked for NASA between 1960 and 1975. I'm going to do a little tease, just a little tease. It's my expertise, radio and TV. There was something that happened during the lunar landing, which right now is exactly, what time is it? It's 8:40, 9:02 New York time. And they popped out of the craft around 10 o'clock New York time, 9 o'clock your time. And something happened prior to that, which was a NASA secret, which Dick Hull knew about, which I'm going to tell you about, even though I've been threatened with death by some NASA people. You can't say that. Nobody's supposed to know that. But if you tune in on September 12th, you will find out about this thing that you're not supposed to know about. So anyway, that's 3 o'clock New York time. Just wanted to make sure on September 12th. But yeah, it's a very, very interesting antidote. And Jim Kennedy, who ran the Space Center down in Cape Canaveral, told him about that. He said, "Who told you?" I said, "I'm not going to tell you." "Who told you? That's not supposed to be known." Well, you'll find out on September 12th.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for joining us tonight, Evan. I'm looking forward to September 12th, which you can sign up for on August 1st. And we'll hopefully see you all at the next program.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cheryl, for inviting me. And thank everybody who is here tonight. And thanks for the compliments.
Okay. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.